Jacob meeting Esau, a challenge, a struggle, as Jacob returning and thinking that Esau, the last thing his own brother had said to him is, next time I see you, I'm going to kill you. And Jacob runs off, and I'm sure that has been going through Jacob's mind for the last 14 years, or more than that, 20 years. The last thing my brother said to me was he was going to kill me. And so we talked about that last week, and just kind of a little bit of a recap. Here's a map of Israel and actually all the way up into modern-day Iraq. And so if you're familiar with Abraham, he came from the land of Ur, which is down here by the Chaldeans, or in Babylon. And then he traveled across what we call the Fertile Crescent, and that's just simply because there's water there and vegetation there. That's the way that Abraham traveled along with his flocks. You might say, but the shortest distance would have been straight across from east to west. And that would be true, except that's right through the Saudi Arabian desert, and not too many people survive going through the Saudi Arabian desert. So, and of course, they didn't have all the modern advances of cars and trucks and helicopters and things like that. So they walked. And then, of course, as you recall, Abraham wanted his son Isaac to have somebody from their family, so they went back up to Haran, which is in northern Iraq. And then when Jacob and Esau had their difficulties, Jacob ran back to their family, which is, again, in the northern Iraq area. And that's where he ran across this beautiful woman called Rachel, and that he pledged to serve for 7 years to have her as his wife. And then, of course, his father-in-law did a dirty trick on him and married him to Leah, Rachel's sister, and then he worked another 7 years, so 14 years total for the two wives. And, of course, you remember the story that there was a competition between these two women, these two wives, of who could have the most children. And it spilled over into their handmaidens, which became sort of surrogate mothers. And that's where we get the 12 descendants, or the 12 children, 12 male children of Jacob. So he's met with Esau. God told him specifically to go south towards Bethel. Instead, Jacob turns north towards Shechem. So he's living outside or near the city of Shechem. And I don't know if this map gives you any better picture or not, but God had specifically told him to turn south toward Bethel, which is where he had said he was going to go with Esau. Esau said, I'm heading back down south. Jacob says, yes, I'm going to go that same direction. And of course, Jacob, being the kind of character that he is, decides to go the other way. For whatever reason, it appears that the fields in the area around Shechem were more luxurious or had greater grasses. Remember, he's primarily a shepherd, so what the pasture looks like and how much water is available and how rich the grass or the fields would be a temptation for him, and that's exactly where Jacob ended up at. Of course, the problem with going to Shechem is that they camped near an ungodly city that became then an influence upon them. And that's sort of the background of the story that we're reading this morning. Instead of trusting the Lord and maybe going to less desirable areas down in Bethel, Jacob decides to follow what his eyes see, but unbeknownst to him, creates all kinds of spiritual difficulties. Now these spiritual difficulties that we'll discuss are not justification for the behavior of the men of Shechem, but when we make choices, ungodly choices, it also affects us very practically speaking. So, Genesis chapter 34, let's read a few verses and we'll talk about it. Now, Dinah, the daughter of Leah, now remember, Rachel and Leah were both wives. Again, this was never part of God's plan for you to have multiple wives, but this is what Jacob's condition was in. When she had borne Jacob and went out to see the daughter's land. So Leah was one of the daughters of Jacob. Now we count the 12 boys because those become the 12 patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. but there were also girls spread amongst there. So one of the girls, who was a daughter of Leah, and by the way, we'll see this a little bit later on, her two brothers, in other words, blood brothers, were Simeon and Levi, and that'll become important as we go through the stories. So she goes out to see the daughters of the land. In other words, she goes to visit some other girls or wants to see them or talk with them. Verse 2, and when Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, prince of the country, saw her, he took her and lay with her and violated her. So this is just not a pretty story, but it's just simply a description of a man seeing somebody else, desiring her, and taking her. Now, even though culturally this would be somewhat excusable, it is not excusable before the Lord. Culturally, and some parts of the world are still that way, if there is a young woman who's unoccupied, in other words, not being escorted by her father or an uncle or brothers, she's considered to be promiscuous, as if she is inviting others to take advantage of her. Now, that is never appropriate, but that was the culture. Just like many times in our culture, there are things that are culturally appropriate but are biblically wrong. Again, culturally, in our culture today, it's accepted for a guy and a girl, boyfriend, girlfriend, to hook up together and just sort of live together as if they're man and wife but never be married. Biblically, that's incorrect, although our culture may even endorse that. So this is what's going on, that she was out wandering, and then this guy sees her, and he happens to be a prince, although not Prince Charming in the right way here, but he happens to be a prince. Perhaps because of his family background, he thinks that he can get away with more things. Verse 3 tells his soul was strongly attached to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the young woman and spoke kindly to the young woman. So he desires her, his soul desires her. But understand this, there's a difference between a desire for some person and godly love. There's a huge difference between the two. Perhaps he is enamored with her. Maybe he's captured by her beauty. Whatever it might be, he has a strong desire. We're not denying that. But that's not the same as a godly love. See, a godly love would not have taken advantage of her in the first place. A godly love would care for somebody else. Matter of fact, the type of love the Bible talks about is a self-sacrificial giving love towards somebody else without expecting anything in return. Many relationships in our world today are based on what I get out of it. I've even been to a few weddings. I didn't perform them, but I was there where they gave their vows, as long as I love you, or as long as you're nice or cute, I'll commit it to you. Not the until death do us part, because that's part of our human condition, where whatever I get out of it, as long as you don't burn the toast, I'll be nice to you, or something like that. As long as you give me I don't know, Gucci handbags, then I'll be faithful to you. But the moment you give me a knockoff, then that's it. It's all over. But that's a human, fleshly, soulful type of relationship, as opposed to a God-centered, God-guided relationship. So now let's begin to explore some of the fallout from this. So Shechem spoke to his father, Hamor, saying, "Get me this young woman as a wife." The phrasing, "get me this young woman," indicates he has a very strong desire for her, but not really a care for what's best for her. I want this. Give me this. Get that for me. Of course, in that culture, there were arranged marriages, so it was culturally acceptable that the father would arrange a marriage for either his daughter or his son. And so even in some parts of the world today, arranged marriages are still something that is active or something that is done. Matter of fact, I have a friend in India, Pastor Garland, who we support as missionaries. As a church, we support them. he has arranged the marriages for his children. One of his sons, his eldest son, came to him. His name happens to be David. You may have met him. He visited a couple years ago. But he fell in love with this girl. And so he went to his father and said, Dad, would you please arrange a marriage with this woman? And of course, his father did after much prayer and so forth. But remember, in the culture, the marriage was arranged. And even though in the Indian standard, they call that a love marriage because the two knew each other ahead of time and desired to be married, versus just a family arranged marriage where dad and mom get together with somebody else, some other family, and they just decide to arrange the marriage. That's the context of what's going on here in Shechem. They have arranged marriages, and the idea of an arranged marriage is what's best for the family. Now, sometimes people, even in our culture, especially in our culture, they decide to get married without any sort of investigation or looking at things in the long view. We are emotionally in love with one another, and I don't care that she burns toast or whatever else. I'm committed to her, which is fine, except we ought to. If nobody in here is young, but if you're young, you ought to seek the input of those that are older in your life to give you wisdom as to a marriage or a commitment for a lifetime. Anyways, so Shechem spoke to his father and said, I want this woman. Verse 5, and Jacob heard that he had defiled Dinah, his daughter. Now his sons were with his livestock in the field, so Jacob held his peace until they came. So Jacob heard about this incident, but didn't do anything about it. He didn't express any anger or frustration or anything else. He just waited. Now, sometimes it might seem appropriate to wait, to allow the emotions of the moment to subside. But as we go through this story, we're going to find that Jacob is partially at fault on a couple of fronts. One, he moved his family to the area God told him, didn't tell him to go to. They were supposed to go to Bethel, which is down south, but instead he went to Shechem. So he exposed his family to this thing. Now, that's not an excuse for the guy doing what he did, but Jacob bears responsibility for that. And because Jacob didn't take a leadership role in defending his family and setting things right, he allows then his two sons to do something which go way overboard. And so Jacob, in this incident here, is not exhibiting godly leadership. So he waits for his sons to come back from the field. They're out in the field tending the flocks. They come back, verse 6. Then Hamor, the father of Shechem, said to Jacob, went out to speak to Jacob. And the sons of Jacob came in from the field when they heard it, and the men were grieved and very angry because he had done a disrespectful thing in Israel by laying with Jacob's daughter, a thing which ought not to be done. So it's appropriate for the brothers to be upset. It's appropriate for the brothers to be upset by the injustice that they see. In this particular case, their sister being violated. It's fine, it's appropriate for us to be upset when we see ungodliness in the world around us. That's an appropriate response. But as we go forward in the story, their response went way above or beyond anything that God would have called them to do. Verse 8, but Homer spoke with them, saying, the soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him as a wife. And make marriages with us. Give your daughters to us, and take our daughters for ourselves. So you shall dwell with us, and the land shall be before you. Dwell and trade in it, acquire possessions for yourselves in it. And so here's the idea. Is Shechem's dad says, look, let's make arrangements. Let's make marriages. Not just my daughter with Shechem, but then my other daughters and your other daughters. And let's just blend our families together. Now, here's a critical point in the scriptures. If Jacob had done that, he would have polluted the messianic line that God had promised. Remember, God had promised through Abraham, specifically through Isaac, and then specifically through Israel, which happens to be Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to Israel later on in just a few more short verses. And so God had made a specific promise all the way back to Adam and Eve, but specifically through Abraham, Isaac, and now Jacob, that God would bring the Messiah through them, eventually down through David, and of course, culminating in Jesus Christ. So God had this specific plan. And here's the problem. Jacob could have really messed this up. Jacob was always called to be a people group that were separate from the people that they lived in. They lived in an ungodly land, but they were called to be godly people in the midst of ungodly individuals. Remember, Rachel had taken her father's household idol when they fled Laban and they encountered Esau. Remember, this idolatry worship had been part of the family. And Jacob hadn't dealt with it clearly. Jacob, again, fails as a leader. He, first of all, connives and cheats his brother out of his birthright. Then he connives with Laban. He is a man whose character has not been transformed yet. He's had encounters with God, but his character has not been transformed. And so, because of his ungodly leadership, his family has suffered consequences. That is not to excuse or say that it's Jacob's fault that Shechem raped his daughter, but Jacob set the scene by compromising in his own life. And many times we see that in our own lives, where we will compromise in some way, and then that leads to greater danger. Sometimes we don't comprehend how when God sets as a boundary and that we think God is being mean to us by saying, don't touch this, really is God being loving to us and saying, don't touch this because it will hurt you. Each of us have, with small children, in the parking lot here in front of the church, you see a small child, even if it's not yours, you'll reach out and grab their arm before they dart out to be run over by the Domino's pizza drivers. Or you'll see them sometimes trying to sneak out the door and you'll go, no, wait for mom, wait for dad, because you care for them. You're not being mean. Now, from a 3-year-old's perspective, you're being mean and blocking them from their freedom. But in reality, you're really being loving. And if you and I, in a small way, can comprehend and understand that, how much greater our great God understands this, that he sets parameters for us and what at times seems restrictions, but it's really for our own good. So they want to make some arranged marriages. And notice the enticement is that it'll be profitable for you. You can trade with us, we can trade with you, and we'll just do business together, and it'll just be profitable. Then Shechem, this is the guy that took advantage of Dinah, Shechem said to his father and her brothers, let me find favor in your eyes. Whatever you say to me, I will give. Now, if you're in a negotiation process, that's probably the worst thing to say. Whatever it takes, I want that. That's not the way to negotiate. And so the sons of Jacob answered Shechem. Now, this is Jacob's sons, Shechem and Hamor and his father, and spoke deceitfully because they had defiled Dinah. What's their deception? We'll find out. And they said, we cannot do this thing to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a reproach to us. But on this condition we will consent to you, if you will become as we are, if every male of you is circumcised. Then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters to us, and we will dwell with you, and we will be one people. Now, circumcision, of course, was an outward sign of the Jewish commitment to be unique and to follow the Lord. It was not unique in that only Jews did it. There were other religious sects, even in amongst the Canaanites, who were familiar with this practice. So we see that the men of Shechem were willing to partake in this, even though it would seem to be odd and strange. Simeon and Levi, though, suggested this for deceitful purposes. And I don't want to be a spoiler, but we'll see it here in just a few minutes. So they say, hey, we can't intermarry unless we are circumcised. Now notice this, circumcision is just an outward thing. How many times have you heard of somebody in order to get married, I've seen this happen several times. In order to get married, I will be a Catholic, or we'll have a Catholic wedding, or we'll have a Lutheran wedding, or we'll have a Baptist wedding. But my heart's not changed. I'll just go through the procedures. I'll go and I'll sit down with the priest or the pastor, and if they say you have to do a sign of the cross or kneel or do whatever else, that's what I do because I want to marry you. But there's not a heart change. It's just going through the rituals. Even in Christian ceremonies, that's always a danger, that individuals will come to somebody like myself and say, we really want to get married, and sometimes they are just going through the motions as opposed to having their hearts surrendered correctly to the Lord. So, verse 17, but if you will not heed us to be circumcised, then we will take our daughter and be gone. And these words pleased Hamor and Shechem, Hamor's son. So the young men did not delay in that very thing, because he delighted in Jacob's daughter. He was more honorable than all the household of his father. And Hamor and Shechem, his son, came to the gate of their city, spoke to the men of the city, saying, these men are at peace with us. Therefore let them dwell in the land and trade in it, for indeed the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters to us as wives, and let us give them our daughters. So it's the idea, hey, look, we made a great deal. Now, I know that the circumcision thing is going to be significant, but my goodness, look at how great a deal this is going to be. Jacob, by the way, is a very wealthy man for that time. He has herds upon herds. He's got livestock. He's got servants. And any city in that area would have been intimidated or concerned about Jacob. He had lots of servants, lots of wealth, and they would have been concerned. And so from a business perspective, this would have been a great deal. This wealthy family is married into the royal family of the city of Shechem, and my goodness, this is a great deal. And I think that the idea of keeping peace, they understood that their quote-unquote prince had violated one of the daughters. Culturally, it would have been acceptable for, this is not biblically acceptable, but culturally it would have been acceptable for the sons, the brothers of this woman who had been violated, to take out the revenge upon them. So they understood that was sort of the backstory. So they think they've come up with this great deal. Verse 22, only on this condition will the men consent to dwell with us, to be one people, if every male among us is circumcised as they are circumcised. Will not, now notice here, look at the greed that comes up. Notice verse 23. Will not their livestock, their property, and every animal of theirs be ours? Look, it's the idea of a guy or a girl saying, well, if I marry into this family is in this business, or they have these possessions, or they've got these cars or houses, and look what I'll get if I marry her or I marry him. He's a doctor, or he's a lawyer, or whatever it might be. And the idea of it's not so much I'm making a commitment to this individual before God as much as look what I get out of this. And unfortunately, too many marriages even today are based on that. Look what I get out of this instead of what I can give. So they're looking at their livestock. And they all went out to the gate of the city. Indeed, Hamor and Shechem, his son, every male was circumcised, all who went out to the gate of his city. So the gate of the city is kind of, it's not anything familiar to us. Like us, I guess it would be sort of the town square. If you think back to 30, 40 years ago, where every Texas town had a town square, and that's where you went in to do business, and that's where the courthouse was, and anything else. If you need to register land, that's where you went in to do that. And that's where everybody gathered. In this time period, the gate of the city functioned like that. Anybody coming in and out of town would have to go through the gate of the city, but it was more than a gate. It was the hub of not only commerce, but also of legal things. If you had a dispute with your neighbor, you'd go to the gate of the city to seek restitution. So it was all of those things sort of wrapped up together. And so they insisted and convinced every male to be circumcised. Now it came to pass on the third day, when they were in pain, they took advantage of them. Notice this. If you perform circumcision crudely, without a sharp instrument, without making sure everything is disinfected and everything else, it can be extremely incapacitating, and the pain level is the worst on, guess what? The third day. Us guys, we tend to think that we're rough and tough and we can handle anything. But circumcision, especially as an adult, would be extremely painful, especially the way that they tended to do it there, without extremely sharp knives and without practicing all of the sterilization that we would practice today. And guess who knew about this? Simeon and Levi. Now, when they suggested this idea, it says that they spoke deceitfully to them. Why? Because they had this as their intention the whole time. Verse 25. Now it came to pass on the third day, when they were in pain, that the two sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, each took his sword and came boldly upon the city and killed all the males. They didn't take revenge only on Shechem. They annihilated this town. They killed Homer and Shechem his son with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah from Shechem's house and went out. And the sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the city, because their sister had been defiled. So Simeon and Levi came in and killed everyone. Their other brothers came along and took the stuff. Does that not sound like even some things that we see in the news even today, where somebody would, in our modern case, we have the upsetting video of George Floyd being killed by this police officer. And then what we see, in some respects, protest to say, hey, this is wrong. But in the midst of that protest, you see individuals who are not there to protest or to seek an agenda, but simply to seek violence. And we've had multiple people being injured and killed. And then, of course, the looting, which it never makes sense to me. You see a sports team that wins and the city gets all excited because their football or their basketball team wins. And what does that city do? Burns down their own town. How is that a celebration of your sports team winning? Or in this case, taking, in some cases, your very own neighborhood or the stores in your area and just looting them or burning them to the ground. And then you complain that stores won't come into your neighborhood, but the last time they were in your neighborhood, you burnt them. So it's an emotional response, not a logical response. And we can understand the emotions, but we need to be better than just our emotions. And this is what Levi and Simeon did. And then the brothers came along and took everything. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain, plundered the city, because their sister had been defiled. They took their sheep, their oxen, their donkeys that was in the city, and all that was in the field, and all of their wealth, all their little ones and their wives they took captive, and they plundered even all that was in the house. So this is, again, going into the city. This is not just seeking revenge for something that happened to your sister, but then it's literally taking all of their stuff. The other wives, the children, had become now their captives or their slaves. And they took all the animals and all the wealth that they could find. Verse 30, then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, you have troubled me by making me obnoxious among the inhabitants of the land, amongst the Canaanites and the Pizzites. Since I am few in number, they will gather themselves together against me and kill me, and I shall be destroyed, my household and I. Now notice Jacob seems to respond, but only when the crisis is about him. He wasn't upset about I'm sure he was upset, but he didn't do anything about his daughter being violated. But now that his sons have created this turmoil and this tension, Jacob appears to turn all the focus back on him. Why have you done this? Now my life is in peril. He's not concerned about the life of his sons or his wives or his daughters. Jacob is totally self-absorbed. And again, this is the same characteristic that we have found in Jacob for multiple chapters, where he's only concerned about himself. Of course, we find him deceiving his own father to get the blessing. Jacob was the younger, although God had promised the blessing to him, but he deceived his own father to pretend to be Esau. And then as soon as Esau found out about it, Jacob runs away. Jacob has always been a man that was only concerned about himself. God is going to get a hold of Jacob. But until God gets a hold of us, if we are only being self-centered or concerned about ourselves, we are in the wrong place. Verse 31, but they said, should he treat our sister like a harlot? Now that's true. It's a good question. Is it appropriate for these men to take advantage of our sister? And the answer is no. But that doesn't justify you killing all the men in the city and then taking all of their stuff. We can, in our current climate, we can certainly agree and say that, yes, what happened to George Floyd is wrong. But then to go and kill others or to riot and loot is also wrong. Two wrongs don't make a right. Now notice verse 35 here. I'm sorry, chapter 35, verse 1. Then God said to Jacob. Jacob was in the wrong. Jacob had done things wrongly. And what happens? God still speaks to Jacob. Notice this heart of God to speak to us individually. That even though we may have done wrong things or we allowed wrong things to happen, maybe we've participated in activities that we know are ungodly, or we allowed others without saying anything to do things that are ungodly, and yet God has a heart for us to repent. God is still willing to speak to us. Now, God does not endorse the behavior of Simeon and Levi, but he's willing to speak to Jacob that he might repent. And we find this throughout the Bible. I think, of course, of King David. When his sin with Bathsheba, God spoke to him that he was the wrong. He was in the wrong. Think about it, Abraham, again, lying about whether his wife was his sister or not. And then, of course, we saw Isaac doing the very same thing. And here we see God encountering Jacob. A classic example from the New Testament is the gentleman known as Saul, who was adamantly opposed to the gospel of Jesus Christ. But he met the Lord on the road to Damascus. And from then henceforth, he was called Paul. We may have messed up in our lives, but God is willing to speak to us if we will listen to him and if we will respond. And this is what happens here, is that he does respond. He does hear the voice of the Lord. Chapter 35, verse 1. Then God said to Jacob, arise, go to Bethel and dwell there and make an altar to God there who appeared to you when you fled from the face of Esau, your brother. So again, this picture, this map may not be the best, but it's the same thing. Up on the northern section is where he was at, up by the city of Shechem. God had originally told him to go to Bethel, and so now he tells him again to go to Bethel. And then to make an altar. And God even reminds him, you remember when you were fleeing and you were afraid and you were concerned for your life, and I met you there? I'm going to meet you there again, is the idea. That if you will cling and call out to God, God will meet us. On Wednesday nights, we finished a couple of weeks ago the book of Jonah. Remember Jonah? God clearly tells him, go to Nineveh. You all know the story. Let's pretend Nineveh is this way. And what does Jonah do? Go the opposite way. Have you ever done anything like that in your life? You know that God has told you to seek him or to pray or to forgive somebody or to do something, and you're like, I'm going just the opposite way. And then when Jonah gets spit out of the fish onto the seashore, what does God say to Jonah? He doesn't say, see, I told you so, which is what I would do. Yeah, you're terrible, Instead, what God says to Jonah, he repeats the same command. Go to Nineveh. So God is willing to work with us in spite of our failures. Jacob is not the most godly character that we find in the Scriptures, yet God is willing to work with him. And may that be an encouragement to us, not an excuse for ungodly behavior, but an encouragement to us that God still wants to speak and work through us. Verse 2, Jacob and his household and all who were with him put away the foreign gods among you and purify yourselves and change your garments. Notice this. I don't know what happened between the end of chapter 34 and the beginning of chapter 35, but something unique and special happened in Jacob's life. Jacob is upset that his daughter has been violated, and he's upset about what his sons have done, and he's scared. He's scared for his own life. Verse 1 of chapter 35, Jacob hears from God, but then notice his response in verse 2. Jacob says to his household, now this is not a family of 5, this is a huge crowd of people. He's got 12 sons, 2 wives, 2 surrogate mothers, plus all the various servants and people that they have acquired along the way. And he says to them, what's the first thing he says to them? Put away the foreign gods that are amongst you, that you may purify yourselves. Jacob knows that they have been compromising in their walk with God. And up until this point, he has not been willing to say anything about it. But now he is. And so he says, put away your foreign gods, which would include his very own wife, his favorite wife, Rachel, who had an idol or a foreign god in her household. Remember when Laban came, he used that as an excuse why he was chasing them down. This a couple chapters ago. Purify yourselves and then change your garments. It doesn't mean that they had stinky clothes. The idea of changing your garments was the concept of, I'm making a radical change. I'm making a transformation. In the New Testament, of course, we have this idea of putting off the old way of doing things and putting on or doing the new. That's the concept here. Notice this. Jacob's children kept foreign gods because their very own mother did. Rachel did. Rachel clung to the household idols of her father from chapter 31. No matter how hard we try to teach our children godly conduct, they will still do what we do. We have to be examples to our own households. And then this concept, we find it in Jude 23, and then also in Ephesians, the idea of using this phrase of a garment. It's the idea of putting off clothing, the idea of putting off stinky, maybe you're out in the yard or you work outside and you're sweaty and dirty all day long. It's the idea of putting those things off, the old ways, the selfish, fleshly centered ways, and put on this fresh, clean garment. I'm dedicated to God. That's the vernacular that they're using here. That's the concept. And that's what Jacob calls his own family to do. Verse 3, then let us arise and go up to Bethel, and we will make an altar there to God, who answered me in the day of my distress and has been with me in the way in which I have gone. Jacob recognized that God first answered him when he was in distress. Jacob is again in distress, but God is again speaking to him, and he says, let's go, let's be obedient. So they gave Jacob all of their foreign gods, which were in their hands, and their earrings, which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them underneath the terebinth tree, which was by Shechem. It's the idea that he buried them in the ground by this tree outside of Shechem. Now they gave them their foreign gods, their little idols, but also their earrings. Now God's not opposed to earrings, except for these earrings appear to be symbols of worshiping these foreign deities. That's what it was. And so God is calling them, and Jacob specifically, is to clean out your household. It's the idea if somebody is, I know for myself, when I first became a believer, there was music that I greatly enjoyed that I needed to get rid of. And I did. It took me a little while to come to that conclusion, but I did. Why? Because that music was not encouraging me in my walk with the Lord. Actually, that music was just the opposite of that. And so I'm not talking about styles of genre of music. I'm just saying those things in your life that may be an ungodly influence, we need to be sure to get rid of them. You may rightly enjoy that. Again, for myself, sports was one of those things. And many of you know that I grew up in San Diego, so the San Diego Chargers were my football team, and they were good enough to get my hopes up, but never really successful. And so emotionally, I would be up and down week by week, depending on what the outcome of the game on Sunday. And eventually, I came to the conclusion of how silly it was for me to be emotionally bound to a bunch of overpaid athletes running around chasing a pigskin. How silly that was of me. And so for a season, I literally didn't watch any football. I can watch a game now and so forth, and most of the time I can just turn it off if I don't like it. Most of the time that is what I do. Or I just watch the scores afterwards instead of going on the emotional roller coaster. Now, for me, that was sports. For somebody else, it might be something else. That if it's got a hold of you where it becomes your God, where your life is dictated by this thing or activity, and that activity or that thing becomes more important than your relationship with God, then you need to give it up and be a person who wholeheartedly seeks the Lord. This is what Jacob is requiring of his family, and they respond. And so these earrings, whatever they were attached to these idol worships. Maybe they were little reminders of their idols. Verse 5, and they journeyed to the territory where God was, they journeyed, and the terror of God was upon the cities where they all were around them, and they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. Now, they just knew that Jacob and his boys had annihilated a town, and they were bigger than Jacob and his family, and they certainly could have come out and destroyed Jacob. But God put a fear in them to protect them so that they get to the right place, and that is down to Bethel. They journeyed, verse 6, so Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, he and all the people with him. And he built an altar there and called the place El Bethel, because there God appeared to him when he fled from the face of his brother. Sometimes crisis is what drives us back to the Lord. And the Lord will use a crisis to drive us back to him. But understand this, we need to go beyond just being crisis Christians. We need to be more than just because of crisis we run back to the Lord. Nothing wrong with running back to the Lord in a crisis. There's no better place to turn than to God in a crisis. But we need to be so firmly established in the Lord that whether it's a crisis or things are going well, we're still seeking the Lord. And so we see a character change in Jacob here in this chapter, where for whatever reason, this particular crisis seems to really have captured his heart. Jacob's been through other crises where he's turned to the Lord, but for whatever reason, it didn't fully capture his heart, or he was unwilling to follow through completely. So he built an altar there. Verse 8, now Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried below Bethel under the terebinth tree. So the name of that place is called Alon Bekoth, which means, place of weeping. So we don't know anything about this Deborah other than what's mentioned here. Apparently, she probably came with Rebekah out of her dad's household in dad's Laban's household to be with her, to be a companion, a helpmate. Maybe she was a servant to her, to assist her. It says Rebekah's nurse, so somebody who cared for her, an assistant, kind of like a butler kind of idea. But of course, the bonds over the 20 plus years had grown close, and they grieved greatly. Then God appeared to Jacob again when he come to Paddan Aram and blessed them. And God said to him, your name is Jacob. Your name shall not be called Jacob anymore. Now, what's the name Jacob mean, you remember? Heel catcher. a conniver, somebody who trips other people up. And notice, in biblical days, names had great significance. Names had to do with the character of that child or prophetic about what that child might be like. And so the names of the different children. And this was the character of Jacob. He was a heel catcher. He was a conniver. He was a guy that was always looking for his own advantage. And we see that throughout his life. In his dealings with Esau, later on, even his dealings with Laban, he is looking out for his own personal advantage. And God is saying, I'm going to change your name. But Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel. The idea here is that God took a man who is selfish in nature, and all of us are, man or woman. We are selfish in nature, but God wants to so transform us. Israel is what God instructs Jacob's name is going to be from now on. And of course, Israel is the nation of Israel that we see today. They're descendants of Jacob. Now, Jacob had 12 sons, amongst other daughters, and that's where we get the 12 tribes of Israel. David would be one of those descendants, and then ultimately the Messiah coming through that line to rescue all of mankind. In chapter 34, it looked like it was in great peril, God's original plan to bring a Messiah promised through specific people, but God's plan was never in danger. We might think that God's plan is in danger because we see things spinning out of control, or our own personal lives are not going the way we would like them to, and we think, well, God's not in control any longer. But God has never lost control. He has always been in control. Sometimes those times where you feel less in control are actually blessings because it requires you to trust more in the Lord than yourself. And notice each crisis in Jacob's life, God did meet him. But oftentimes it took huge crises in Jacob's life for him to be met by the Lord. And then his character to be changed. Verse 11, God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply a nation. A company of nations shall proceed from you, and kings shall come from your body. The land which I gave to Abraham and Isaac I give to you, to your descendants after you, I give this land. So the same promise that God originally made to Abraham, then to Isaac, he's now making to Jacob, who's now called Israel. Then God went up from him in that place where he talked with him. So Jacob set up a pillar in that place where he was talking with him, a pillar of stone, and he poured a drink offering on it, and he poured oil on it. The idea of a drink offering is, if you recall the sacrificial system, what you would do is you take, say, a lamb, as an example, and you would slaughter the lamb, and you put it on the altar to be barbecued, but you kept a portion of it back. Some of it was fully consumed by the fire, especially in the Levitical system. A portion was given to the priests to provide for them and their family. And then the family that brought that, they kept it, and they were able to consume it itself. So the lamb, we all partake together, but the lamb wasn't totally lost to that individual. But a drink offering is totally poured out. There's no coming back. You don't get any benefits back from it. You're totally giving yourself over to that. And that's the idea here, to be poured out as a drink offering. Jesus sort of uses that same idea where he talks about himself being poured out as a drink offering for us. The Apostle Paul uses that same terminology in Philippians chapter 2 and 2 Timothy, that we would be poured out. It's the idea that we would serve somebody else or do something with no expectation of a return back. It's one thing for you to take a lamb and say, okay, God, I'm going to sacrifice this to you, but knowing I get a good rump roast out of it, I get something out of it and I get to keep this. Whereas a drink offering, I have nothing left for myself. I'm totally and absolutely giving this over to God. And that's the idea that Jacob's heart here has been changed. Jacob's heart, or Israel's heart, is now one of gratitude and of worship and a willingness to pour out his life for God. We saw before that Jacob was always holding something back for himself. What's in it for me? And sometimes we as Christians, we even approach God that way. Okay, God, I'll do things your way, but what's in it for me? What do I get out of this? Okay, I get forgiveness of sins. That's nice. Eternity in heaven. I like that better. So I'll serve you, God, for the sake of eternity in heaven. And if we start there, that's okay. But as Christians, we ought to grow to the point of being more mature where we say, I just want to be in the presence of God. Give me a little shack in the very back corner of heaven as long as I can be in the presence of God. That's what I desire. I desire to be with God. I don't care about the crowns or rewards or mansions. I just want to be in the presence of God. And that needs to be our heart. And Jacob's heart seems to have changed from being a man that's primarily concerned about what he gets out of it to be a man who is primarily able to say, I want to give all that I have for the sake of God. And that's what God wants to do in each of our lives, to change us, to transform us, to be people who are willing to give, and to give without expectation in return, and more importantly, to give to God. When we give to God, when I say giving, I know usually we run to the idea of money. But God is more concerned not only of money, but of our time and our efforts and possessions. Are you willing to give of your time to serve somebody else? Maybe especially with this COVID-19, you have a friend, a family member, somebody you know who can't or is uncomfortable going to the store, but you're comfortable to go to the store. Do you willingly go to the store for them, for the sake of serving them? Maybe you go to the store and you find something, you say, look, I know Fred would like 2 of these, so let me buy 2 extras and I'll drop it off at Fred's house. I use Fred because there's no Freds here, but you get the idea. You find something on sale and you think, wow, I think Sally would like this, so let me get a couple of these and just drop it off at Sally's house. And maybe you drop it off and you don't even tell her or him where it came from. You just sort of doorbell ditch them. You drop it off on the door, you ring the doorbell, and you run away like UPS does, right? And then they open up and there's 2 of these things. Wonderful. But see, that's sacrificially. I want to bless so-and-so. Maybe it's just a card or a phone call or an email just for the sake of blessing somebody. That's what we're called to do. Again, Jacob earlier was always about me. What do I get out of this? And now that his name's been changed to Israel, we see a heart change where it's more about what I get to give to God. By the way, you can't outgive God, whether it's your time or your resources, your talents, or even your money. You will never outgive God. Now, please, I'm not trying to twist your arm about giving. I always feel uncomfortable about the idea of giving because there are so many others, especially that are on TV, that are always twisting arms to say that you must give. Or, you watch late night TV and there's always somebody, give for the dogs, give for the orphans, give for this, give for that. Don't you want to help the children? And yes, I want to help the children. No, I don't want, dogs to be abused. But that's an emotional heart's tug. And because people are so often trying to tug on our emotions, I want to be careful that I'm not tugging on your emotions. I'm just saying this. If you give to God, you will not outgive God, whether it's your time, your resources, or yes, even your finances. But don't give because I said something, but give because that's what God calls you to give. So, God gives us blessings. Jacob set up a pillar there. And then verse 15, and Jacob called the name of the place where God spoke to him, Bethel. And then they journeyed from Bethel, and there was but a little distance to go to Ephraim. And Rachel labored in childbirth, and she had a hard labor. Now it came to pass when she was in hard labor that the midwife said to her, do not fear, you will have this son also. So obviously she's older. Childbirth, the older you get, obviously is harder. And so it came to pass her soul was departing, for she died. She died, in other words, in childbirth, or right after childbirth. Sure, she called the name Ben-Oni, but his father called his name Benjamin. Ben-Oni means child of sorrow, or you bring sorrow. That's what she called it, the son. But the father called his name Benjamin, which is son of my right hand, my trusted, reliable boy. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephraim, that is Bethlehem. Interesting. Bethlehem, just outside of or right near Bethlehem. And Jacob set up a pillar on her grave, which is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. Now, Moses is the one who's writing this, so this is at the time of Moses, that pillar was still there. Then Israel, formerly known as Jacob, journeyed and pitched his tent beyond the tower of Eder. And it happened when Israel dwelt in the land that Reuben went and lay. This is again another bad thing. Reuben, his oldest son, went and lay with Beulah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard about it. The sin, the uncaring, the lack of devotion to follow God has gone from Jacob and his mom to his own sons. Now the sons of Jacob were 12. The sons of Leah were Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun. And the sons of Rachel were Joseph and Benjamin. The sons of Bilhah, Rachel's maidservant, was Dan and Naphtali. The sons of Zephyr, Leah's maidservants, were Gad and Asher. And these were the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Padan Aram. Then Jacob came to his father, Isaac, at Murah, or Kibroth Arba, which is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had dwelt. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years. So Isaac breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people, being old, full of days, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. Notice the family line is we followed Abraham, then we followed Isaac, and we followed primarily Jacob, who's now been called Israel. It's not that Esau is an important character, but biblically speaking, he's not important because the Messiah doesn't come from Esau's line. It comes from Jacob or Israel's line. Benjamin, if we fast forward, you remember when Joseph, the same Joseph, the man with the kid with the coat of many colors, or the fancy coat, when they sell him into slavery, he wants who to come to be with them as sort of a guarantee that they'll return? He wants Benjamin. And Jacob says, "Don't you take Benjamin from me." And so we see these characteristics being played out. Next week, we'll look at Esau and his family. And that'll sort of be the last of any biblical emphasis on Esau. Then we'll follow Joseph and his dreams. And we'll find Joseph, of course, going down into Egypt. And then him being elevated. And then the great famine. And God using Joseph to preserve the nation of Israel, his 11 brothers. And that famous line that Joseph said to his brothers, "What you intended for harm, God intended for good." The sin of mankind is never justified. The son laying with the concubine, which is basically the surrogate mother, is never appropriate. The taking advantage, the rape of a daughter is never appropriate. These are sins that are clearly laid out for us. God is interested in people's hearts. We can outlaw all kinds of sin. Matter of fact, there's all kinds of laws on the books today with the desire to make people live better lives. But that doesn't change the heart, does it? I have had the opportunity, as some of you others have, to go into prisons and to minister to men and women in prison, and the prison doesn't change the heart of the individual. Only a relationship with Jesus Christ changes that. And that's what our country needs. That's what we each need. We need a relationship. We need to be much more like Israel and a lot less like Jacob. Jacob, a man who was primarily looking at everything, how it affects me, to Israel, who was looking at how it affects others. May God give us that sort of heart. So let's pray. Father, I thank you for your word. Father, I thank you that even the grittiness, the ugly side of humanity is displayed for us. Lord, I thank you that you are God that continues to call upon us, that you desire to speak to us, Lord, in spite of our own hardness of heart. And Lord, I ask that you would continue to soften our hearts, that we be soft and pliable in your hands. Bless everyone here, Father. Bless those within the sound of my voice, Lord. Bless them abundantly with a vibrant relationship with you. In Jesus' precious name, amen. God bless you all. Good to see you guys.